thanks for joining us. Now that we've seen the film, very intense, very raw, and I found it inspiring. So we have today with us Morgan Neville, who is the director, and Caitrin Rogers, who is one of the producers. So thank you both for being here so much. Let's start with the broad, and we'll get down to the narrow. Movies that involve people who are in food can sometimes get pretty niche, right? And this, I found Roadrunner to be a very generalist type of film, a very generalist biopic type of film. There's plenty of food, right? And it plays the character that it plays, but none of it was self-serving. None of it was just there for the food porniness of it. And so I wonder what your challenge was when you're taking on somebody who is a food icon. How do you balance that story, and how do you insert the food into it?
Well, thanks, Mary Beth, for doing this. Happy to talk about the film. This is one of the first times, maybe the first time I've ever really talked about the film. So it's all raw and fresh for us as well. And the thing, as we talk about in the film, is Tony's journey from the kitchen to the world and through food is interesting because, Tony obviously knew and loved and understood food, and in part understood the world through food. But as the years went on, he kind of shed that more and more. And I think food is an incredible Trojan horse to understanding all kinds of things about the world and telling all kinds of stories, and he got that. But I didn't feel like I needed that kind of a prism to tell the story. The food was always going to be there, and Tony's origin story is always rooted in food in the kitchen. And I think, the thing that I came away from it is, it's not like Tony was one of the world's great chefs. He was a very effective kind of executive chef at a middling New York restaurant. And, I think Tony's obsessiveness, his OCD, basically made him somebody who was really good at running a kitchen. He was the most punctual person anybody who ever knew him had ever met. He was always 15 minutes early for every single thing. But what I think Tony also got out of kitchens is, the sense of, like, he always called it the pirate ship. There was a sense of like getting a bunch of people together, and it's you against the world. And, anything can happen. It can be bawdy, it can be rough, it can be profane, but the kitchen is this thing where, people bond together in this common pursuit of creating pleasure and food for people. And I think how he treated his TV show was the same way he ran a kitchen. It was the same group of people stuck with him year after year, and they had this kind of pirate ship mentality that stayed with him. He liked that kind of structure in his life, and I think food just became this kind of way he could start to find common ground with people. He couldn't speak all the languages, he couldn't even understand a lot about it, but he could understand food. And I think food became his toehold into starting to figure out how to make sense of the world. And as the years went on and the shows went on, from Cook's Tour to No Reservations to Parts Unknown, he didn't need as much of the food to be able to actually kind of get to the bigger, deeper questions he was always going for.
And I think that's very clear in the film, that this is part of Bourdain's legacy, right? Because I want to talk about the journey that the film takes you on from the time of the publication of Kitchen Confidential on, but it's really Bourdain's legacy that he is an American storyteller. I think it really makes that point, as do his friends. He's not a travel host. He's not somebody who's just reading a voiceover. He's writing it, he's involved, he's there on the ground, and he's turning food into something that, and it's funny because in 2001, it sounds like something that we've heard so many times, like food unites us, but that wasn't something people were talking about when he published Kitchen Confidential and when he went out into this world.
No, and I think Tony's part of this big narrative about food over the last 20 years not only how food is elevated and how we look at food figures as kind of cultural figures now, and now we have lots of shows and books and ways in which we look at chefs to help us decipher our culture and our world around us. But also, I think there was a kind of a small d democratic view of food, the idea that street food is as important as Michelin star food, that Tony was definitely at the forefront of, and now that is, everywhere in our foodie world. But Tony was absolutely a pioneer in that way. And I saw it again and again, and everybody I talked to echoed that again and again. And I think that was something, Tony loved the high-end food. He could appreciate it. He understood, he had studied those techniques. He had worked in those kitchens. But he was the one who also bristled at the kind of pretension sometimes, and certainly the kind of classist structures behind fine dining. And, he was, a punk rock, rebel till the end. And he would, his idea of taking his spotlight and shining it on any kind of food and finding value in it, I think is something that, we're all just catching up to now.
And by showing street food, you can actually show people, right? That you're showing people and the way that they actually eat every day. And Caitrin, I would love to ask you about this, because as a producer, this must have been an interesting sort of slog through the CNN archives, right? But I do think that when you bring in, when he was there in Beirut during the bombing, and that's what he was trying to, he was trying to do the show, and it was sort of like, I don't want to exploit this experience just for content. And so that balance of those two things, and showing real people eating real food.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was simultaneously one of the easiest films we've ever done and one of the hardest. I think having that gold mine of archive, it was, we had hundreds and hundreds of hours of CNN, not only CNN archive, but archive from his earlier shows. And then we found the early archive from an unreleased project. That's the stuff of him in kind of at the beginning of the film. And, it was, that turned into a real challenge in that there was so much. And we had an entire team of people who were sort of, wading through all of it, trying to find these moments that really, told the story of who Tony was and these sort of emotional beats and his journey from where he was to where he ended up. And I think also there was just a huge amount of responsibility to tell this, to create a portrait of someone that we didn't actually know, that a lot of people did know, and that a lot of people felt like they knew, and kind of finding a film that sort of told the story that satisfies all the different versions of Tony. I think it was difficult, but I hope that we did a good job in the end.
Yeah, Tony was a very, complex character in that way, and had a slightly different version of Tony for different people. And that was, something that we absolutely were trying to kind of chase from the beginning. And it was such a, we didn't know him, as Kate said. We did know people who knew him. I created a TV show called Ugly Delicious with David Chang. When we started that show, David went to Tony, this is 2016, and kind of got Tony's permission, like going to the Don to ask permission from the Godfather, is it okay? And Tony blessed it and said, yes, it's okay. And we did that show, and it was through David and a bunch of the chefs I got to know in that world, who were all friends of Uncle Tony, that, I really understood kind of what he meant to them. And then when he died, seeing the kind of cratering effect that had on these friends of mine, that was something that stuck with me. I mean, I think those of us in the public who liked him and had maybe read his books or watched the show, I think there was a kind of a gut punch of how the hell did that happen? Like, this is somebody who I just can't imagine killing themselves, and he did. But seeing what that meant for people around him, I'd felt that more than anybody who had no connection to him would have. And so I think when it came time to think about making this film, there was just this, it's that sense of don't screw it up. Like, how do you pay homage to somebody as complex and protean as Bourdain in a 2-hour film, and it's not easy. But I often was thinking about how do I get inside of Tony's head? I mean, I think of the film ultimately as really a psychological portrait more than anything, and thinking about how do you make a film that Tony would respect? I mean, he was such a cineast. He loved movies, he loved music, he loved books. And, and we're trying to kind of get the texture of all that stuff. In the very beginning, we took every song he ever mentioned in every interview, every book, every show, every podcast, every playlist, and we put together a playlist that we made on Spotify for ourselves. I just looked at it this afternoon. It's 18 and a half hours of songs. And basically we listened to that. That was like our getting into the gestalt of Tony by listening to Tony's music and thinking about it and all of these things to help us feel like we were kind of hitting all the right touchstones of Tony's life. But then once we got into making the film, realizing that as much as Tony was a great narrator of his own story, which he did again and again in the show and the books, that there was a certain point where he wasn't anymore. That, particularly as his depression kind of kicked in and he became less kind of circumspect about his own life, I think he couldn't narrate his own story anymore. Other people had to. And in a way, I felt like in the beginning, I was thinking, how do I make a film that Tony would like? And at the end, I was like, how do I make a film that honors the people who had to survive Tony? And how do you do both those things? And that really became the challenge of making the film then, was not just to celebrate the life, but to honor the kind of trust that these people put into us by doing these interviews. And it's not just these interviews. I mean, we spent hours and hours and hours talking to these people, and we actually interviewed probably twice as many people as are in the film. And just the amount of kind of personal time and investment these people gave us to kind of open up, usually, in fact, often, but maybe even usually for the first time, people kind of giving people permission to kind of talk about this in a way that I think many of the people we interviewed literally had not talked to anybody about what they really felt about Tony until they did interviews for us for the film. So they were tough. Definitely the longest, toughest interviews of any film I've ever done. So I felt like we just had to pay that back in some way in the film as well.
And that's interesting that you mentioned the interviews, because more than one person said, this is the first time I've ever talked about this. And more than one person said, this is the last time I'll ever talk about this. And I thought that was really interesting too. And I think I had known about your work with Ugly Delicious and your work with David Chang, and the way that even David Chang would open up about certain things that he just said, I've never said this before. And that's an enormous trust that people put in you, and to choose what to put into the film that is a character development versus a development of his life, right? Because it was such a big 18 years that you cover. And as we said, we talked about, it was such a, it's a time, a lot of BS in food TV, which you touch on at the beginning of the film. And I think we all know how Bourdain felt about a lot of food TV, but I did find it really wonderful that you addressed all of those things, right? That you sort of were able to put those little things in, because it's such, as I said, it's a big 18 years that you cover.
Absolutely. And it's funny, for all of Tony's kind of protestations about celebrity and food TV, like when he complains in the film about, God, I'm doing Oprah, what a sellout. Like, he's loving it. He is loving it. So as much as he wanted to keep his street cred about being cool. Like, you know, he really, he couldn't believe his good luck. I mean, he was somebody who, and many people told me, you know, up until his death, that he just felt like he was getting away with something. Like people they're gonna find out I'm just a fake and they're gonna take all this away from me. Like he just couldn't ever believe that he deserved all that he had done during all those years.
Well, that's why I think it's so interesting that he really inserted himself, his voice, his personality, almost from the very beginning. And you have his creative partners, who are also, I understand, producers, who talk about, you know, the first couple of days or the first trip or whatever, and he was getting warm. But I mean, that doesn't take very long, right? It doesn't take very long for him to go from lukewarm to red hot, right? And I think that's what's so interesting about many people in the creative field, is that at the same time that they are like, oh my gosh, I'm getting away with something, they're also projecting their voice because, oh my gosh, they have a platform too, and that's exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, you know, as you point out, you know, we pick up the story when he's 40, about to turn 44, you know, and for somebody to have a totally life-altering success in their mid-40s is not common. It's in fact very, very unusual. And I think that affected everything else about, you know, the 20 plus years Tony had spent in kitchens before then, and his kind of feeling of like, I can't, you know, I got away with something, you know, that if you go back and read Kitchen Confidential now, at the end of Kitchen Confidential, there's a sense that his story is over. You know, he talks about it like, you know, I've kind of lived my life, and there's not much else to say, and his life in many ways hadn't begun. I mean, it's actually really interesting to see it in that way. And I think when he saw this window open to be able to travel the world and do all these things, that he just felt like, you know, he was still only a couple steps away from standing in front of a deep fryer, till 1 a.m. every night. And that just never left him.
And the idea that he hadn't really traveled until then, which I love that you put in, because there really was a sense of wonder to everything that he was doing. He really was excited to try the food. He really was excited to talk to the people because he hadn't done it before. And so that sort of wonder of travel, I think, is part of what made his shows so special.
100%. You know, so to see somebody, he was so, you know, so full of wonder and awe, and such a lack of any jadedness whatsoever. You know, so he was just to be able to kind of capture that. I think people sense that all the time. I mean, the reason you watch those shows is because of him. It's not just, visiting whatever country or city. It's that it's his perspective that shapes all those things. And everything he did in his books and in his shows was informed by this deep subjectivity of, this is not, I'm not giving you the objective portrait of whatever this city is or whatever this country is. This is my journey of stuff I'm curious about. And I think the show was best when Tony was excited about something, Tony was curious about something, that made for the best television, you know. And there were definitely many, many episodes where they were labors of love, you know, definitely going to places like Libya and Iran and Lebanon and places like that were things that Tony was really excited about. There were some other episodes where it'd be like, okay, can we just do like an easy episode for a break? You know, can we just go, where's there a nice beach? Can we do an episode there? So his crew said, you know, whenever you see one of those episodes where he's by a beach, that's probably the, like, can we just take it easy episode? But every season up until the end, and even, you know, beyond the end, is what he was planning for in the future. You know, every season he was doing a handful of tough episodes and going to tough places. And that's really what got him excited.
And that was a great scene with him in Beirut with the bombs going off and sitting by the pool and just being like, I don't, just having to have a human mind that holds both of those things at the same time. So let's talk about the death and how you handled it. At the very beginning, as we all saw, you sort of mentioned it up front, because it's like, I mean, you tell me, but it's sort of like you've got to, right? If you don't.
I think part of it was, what was different about how we made this film from anything else I've ever worked on is because his death was such a kind of explosive and recent event that I didn't want us to be looking at his whole story through the lens of his death. So when we started making the film, I said to my first editor, Eileen Meyer, start at the beginning, look at the interviews that talk about the beginning of his life, but don't think about or look at or touch anything that has to do with the last couple of years of his life. And so we literally started and cut the first scene, and then we cut the second scene, and then we cut the third scene. And we cut the film linearly for a long, long time, which I'd never done quite that way, with kind of no thought about what was going to happen, because we read history backwards, but we live life forwards. So how do we tell the story as he would have lived it? We don't know where it's going to go. And so I think in our first edit, we were too successful, where people are like, oh, it's so fun in the first hour. There's such excitement and wonder in Tony in the first hour, that the way his story turns out is like such a big turn that we realized we needed to remind the audience that we'll get there. Like, we're not going to, kind of whitewash the story or only give you part of it. In a way, it's just reminding the audience that we know where the story is going, and that's okay. But in the meantime, let's go with Tony on this journey to really see it through his eyes as actively as we can from that moment where his life changes.
And it does feel like something, because he has so many fans, right? That you have to earn. You have to almost earn that discussion at the end. And so putting it up front, but then I think it was the last third or quarter of the film is about sort of that the journey to the end. I mean, I don't know how you both think of that, but I don't find it to be a 180 in any way, but it does sort of, flow into that maybe 2/3 of the way into the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, is often the case with brilliant, complex people like Tony, that the things that made him great were the things that made him flawed. His obsessiveness, his profound curiosity. And I thought a lot about this question of him being a seeker. And, we think about being curious and being a seeker is a good thing. I do think it's a good thing, that he was somebody who always wanted to learn more, to go to more places, to meet more people. But I also feel like he was such an extreme seeker that at a certain point, you're not seeking, you're running. And I think that is the other side of that coin. And I think so many of these things with Tony are two sides of the same coin. That Tony was always out there looking for the next thing, seeking something, seeking enlightenment, seeking knowledge. But he had a hard time hanging on to the things he had found along the way, because he was always looking for the next thing. He started doubting things he shouldn't have been doubting in his life, and I think about this a lot. He had a tattoo he got that said, "I am certain of nothing," from an old book he had read about Montague, and it was from ancient Greek, and it was this tattoo he had based on an old Greek coin. And there's something about that sounds very Zen and cool, and like, yeah, you're without judgment. That's great. But at a certain point, if you're certain of nothing, if you're really, really certain of nothing, then you're lost. And I think that was the kind of conundrum that Tony found himself in. He wasn't just a weekend seeker or a casual seeker. He was a seeker to a point where at a certain point, you find yourself in a hall of mirrors, And I think that's where Tony ended up at the end of the day. So it's all connected, the good and the bad.
And at what point, because his friends, I don't think that the movie tries to answer the question why, right? I don't think that the film is in the business of answering that question, but I do think there's a lot of poignancy at the end with his friends trying to sort of talk out why this happened, or not being willing to talk about it at all, of course, in the case of Eric Repair. And the sort of, and I'm sure, well, you tell me, what was it difficult to cover that, given the fact that the death was so covered by the media, and there are so many people who want to talk about why they think it happened, right? People who didn't know him.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that challenging to go into that like last part where it was sort of like addiction to person, unlovable, there are lots of different sort of things that his friends talk about. And so I don't know if that was a difficult line to walk for you.
I mean, it was incredibly difficult, had to deal with something like a suicide, and talking to people about it was difficult. And the fact is there was no clear answer. And we even had people disagreeing in the film about what they think happened. However, I think the overall trajectory of it happening, everybody understood at some level that Tony, particularly in the last, kind of year and a half of his life, became more depressive. I think his highs got higher and his lows got lower. And I think, Tony was always an addict. He was an addict who had been a junkie, literally a junkie, who never stopped drinking, and would still party in different ways, that he was not somebody who had really ever gotten control of the things that haunted him, and he had those in his life the entire time. So, I guess the common way of saying it would be, was it shocking? Yes. Was it a surprise? No. That's how I think a lot of people in his life felt, when Chris and Lydia said they got the phone call, it's like that when the phone rings in the middle of the night, I think a lot of people felt like, oh, he's finally done it. All that being said, I think there were probably other moments like this that had maybe happened in the past, and he didn't do anything as irrational as this. And many people say, and I believe this, that if he had gotten through that night, he would have been okay. That it was just an impulsive, deeply impulsive move. And, that's borne out by the fact that, he was making lunch plans that afternoon. He didn't write a suicide note. He, was giving notes on cuts that evening. It's not like he wasn't acting like somebody who had any kind of a plan. I think it was literally just a really bad moment. And I think everybody, I think that was pretty common amongst people, that he had big problems that would put him in that kind of a position, but that he had always been a little precarious, and this just happened to be a lot of bad things happening at the exact wrong moment. But there is no clear-cut answer, and I think that's the thing we have to grapple with. But I think that's the nature of, frankly, depression and mental illness. I think that's the thing I think we came to realize is, as much as it's a film about Tony, it's also a film about suicide and how people have to recognize it and come to terms with it. And I think having done all these interviews, trying to honor the kind of the emotional impact an act like that has on people, it's not a glamorous view of suicide. I think part of Tony was, subscribed to the live fast, die young kind of rock and roll ethos. That was, Johnny Thunders and all these people who are like Tony's heroes. And that's bullshit, frankly. So I think that's what I learned by spending all that time with all those people, is that is absolute bullshit.
And I think we could have spent a lot more time on the death, because it was also, because it's not clear cut. But this film, I don't think was ever meant to be about the death. It was about his life. And so I think one of the challenges was just getting that balance right, where we could talk about it without shining the whole spotlight on it.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. We're out of time. I didn't get to ask about how the pivot from Mr. Rogers to Anthony Bourdain, which, you know, both American storytellers, right? It probably
TV stars, American storytellers.
Yeah.
Though very, you know, I think they both had a moral core, but I think Tony, I think, wanted to be more Keith Richards than Mr. Rogers. So.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Caitrin Rogers, Morgan Neville, and thank you so much for to AFI DOCS, to the American Film Institute. The film opens July 16th. Perhaps you will be able to go get dinner afterwards and talk about it. This is, as you have just seen, a film that you will probably want to have lots of discussions about for many days. And I will tell both of you, I can't wait to say it in a theater on a screen, on a big screen, because the idea of seeing those travel pieces, right? The scenes in the desert, or the film scenes over the Congo, really looking forward to seeing those on a big screen. So thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Mary Beth.
Thank you.